Okay, so let's take a look at some of these conserved genes and how important they've been to the development of anatomy in different species, different taxa. So one of the interesting examples of developmental control is these Hox genes, right? These Hox genes are found in numerous different taxa. They're found throughout the animal kingdom. What's interesting here is the Hox genes, they are themselves very much conserved. They must be very important because if you remember correctly, the reason that specific genes are conserved from one organism to the other is that it works. And since it works and it's very important to the survival of the organism, any changes in that gene are dangerous and generally lead to not a successful outcome. So the genes are conserved. Now, what's interesting is that these genes impact what's interesting is how they work, one, and two, that their position in the genome and how they're regulated control some fairly fundamental developmental processes. So what I mean by that is that, again, remembering that just the fact that it's conserved suggests that it's very important. But then we found out that these Hox genes control the development of the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Even though the Hox genes are conserved, they can be located in different places in different organisms. For instance, it's on a single chromosome in Drosophila, which is, again, a fruit fly. And in mice, it's found on several different chromosomes. But still, between a fruit fly and a mouse, they both have these Hox genes. These Hox genes allow for development of new forms of organisms. They're one way in which we can get new forms of organisms. So when we look at what happens when you evolve new forms, we have to consider that you don't have to start from scratch. You can take something that already exists and adapt it and change it slightly, and then all of a sudden it changes the function. Or what could happen, so again, let's make sure I'm clear that when you have a structure that already exists, and you modify it, that's one way in which you can get evolution, right? But you could also have more than one function for the same structure, and you can have redundancy. So you can have a structure that can do a thing, but then it allows there's more than one structure on the organism that can do it. Apes, for instance, can grasp things with their feet as well as their hands. It's relatively redundant, and humans don't normally grasp things with their feet. They use them mainly for walking, because we walk on two legs. There's just one example. Here's another example of how you might be able to use the same structure in different ways. Here's two insects. You see, well, actually one insect and one arachnid. Remember, arachnids have eight, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 legs, where insects have 6, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Where the insect has antenna, the scorpion has developed those antennae into pincers and uses it to tear apart its prey and eat it. So these same appendages had a common ancestor, just one taxa used those structures for a specific function, and another taxa, another group of organisms that evolved from a common ancestor, since they're both what we call arthropods. Arthropods. Now, understand, arthropods have exoskeletons. Exoskeletons are that hard outer shell, right? So both the insect and the arachnid, whether it be a spider or a scorpion, they both have these hard outer shells, and they're called arthropods. There are differences between them: 6 legs, 8 legs. These have in this case, a scorpion has pincers. The insect has antenna. The point is that these appendages, they both had a common ancestor, and this lineage, it so happened that found that using these appendages as antenna was an advantage, where this lineage used those appendages as pincers as an advantage. Also, the idea that you have these modules, right? These sections, you have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, which means the head could evolve and the thorax could stay relatively the same in different species, different taxa. Or perhaps the thorax evolves and the abdomen and the head stay the same. Or any combination of these. So dividing the body plan or the control mechanisms into modules or sections allows for one module or section to evolve almost independently of the other, which increases the variation in form, right? So you can get two similar body plans that have different pincers or different numbers of legs, or yet they both have hard exoskeletons. They both have pretty much the same body plan. It's just these have 6 and these have 8, and these have pincers and these have antennas. So you can get change in specific structures in some parts and still keep the parts that are successful. So having redundancy, in other words, having more than having a backup, right, allows for one or the other to evolve freely. And how is that? Why is that the case? Well, let's think about it. If you have an organism, let's just draw a box, and has 2 appendages that help it pick things up, but has 2 others that also help it pick it up. Then if these 2 continue to pick things up, but these 2 evolve, a change happens, then even if the initial change, the mutation that occurred, isn't very useful, they can continue breeding, eating, because they have 2 that function in their original function, right? They still can pick things up. These 2 maybe they can't pick things up anymore because they evolved a little crick in them, or maybe they have an extra joint. Then some other mutation along the line over time has that same box, and it's still able to pick things up with the 2 appendages in the front, but now those things that had the extra joint that made it not be able to pick things up, can't get it to the mouth, now all of a sudden they can be used as pincers. Now they still can't pick things up because of their angle or what have you. But perhaps these claws, now they're what we might look at as claws, right? Now these claws can tear things apart. And they're very useful to bring things over to the parts that pick things up and bring it to the mouth, into the throat. Perhaps that's what happened with the scorpion, that these appendages were something like antenna. The antenna function was taken over by something else. As these mutated over time, you didn't start with something that looked like this one day, and then the next day the antenna turned into claws. You had small changes over time, a genetic variation that allowed organisms to survive with not so successful antenna that still allowed it to the organism to walk around and eat and be successful at breeding. And over time, it developed these pincers that gave it the ability to tear apart its enemy or its food source. So the point is that they're multifunctional, right, or structures that have more than one function, or the idea of redundancy, that you have more than one structure doing the same job, allows organisms the freedom, there's taxa, not organisms, taxa, species, or populations, the freedom to have genetic variation that would then allow for the evolutionary mechanisms to come into play that would allow for the selection of the most fit to survive, and you might then end up having organisms that look like this as the allele frequency changes in the population. And of course, having this the ability in arthropods and invertebrates to have, head, thorax, abdomen, head, chest, abdomen, right? That allows for evolution, again, having genetic variation. You can have genetic changes in the thorax and not impact the head or the abdomen, and vice versa. So kind of one of the examples of this ability to have these three things, the redundancy, the having more than one, that does a similar function so that you can have a variation and still allow for the function to continue. Remember, one of the reasons Hox genes are conserved because their function are very important to the survival of the organism. So having more than one Hox group or Hox genes, and by the way, Hox genes are groups of genes, right? And they do all kinds of functions. It's not a gene. They're actually organized into groups and families, and they have various names. Well, one example of the redundancy of these Hox genes and the power of redundancy is that there's a number of, as I said, there's a number of Hox genes, there's a number of families or groups of Hox genes, and the number of them and how they control expression allows them to change, allows for a change to occur that can be productive as far as evolution is concerned. So you can look at the number of genes and where they are, and for instance, this HOXE6 helps control the length of the neck. So when we look at the neck in vertebrates, where that HOXE6 is, how many copies, again, redundancy, right? The mouse, the snake who has no neck, still has a HOXE6. And the chicken still has a HOXE6. But because there's this redundancy, you can increase the number of vertebrae from zero, right, from nothing, no vertebra in between the two, no cervical vertebra, right, to something has the largest number of cervical vertebrae. So the distance, the number of neck vertebrae between the various cervical vertebrae and the length of the length of the neck can change in the same groups. By the way, snakes, mice, chickens and geese all have vertebra, bones in the backbones. That's why we're all vertebrates. And humans are also vertebrates. We have vertebra, we have bones, we have a backbone. So the number of vertebra in our neck can change depending on the organization and how many of these Hox genes are, how they're expressed, where they're expressed, and it's in part due to the ability to have the redundancy, the number of copies of these Hox genes that exist. It allows for variation among vertebrates so that you can have something like a snake and then something like a goose and everything in between. If you didn't have any, the organism wouldn't be able to do much of anything it does, as is obvious since even Drosophila, which is a fruit fly, doesn't have a backbone, has Hox genes. In fruit fly, it doesn't control the neck length because fruit flies don't have necks. They don't have vertebra. But they do control the body plan. And just as these Hox genes control the body plans in vertebrates, in insects or invertebrates, the body plan is controlled by Hox genes. And it's this very important concept that these genes, number one, control body plan, number two, that allows for evolution within very important conserved regions. You by increasing the number and again having this redundancy, having this modularity, having the ability to have one family of genes here and one family of genes there in different places that control different parts of the body structure allows for the genes to evolve, or allows for increased variation, allows the species to evolve, and allows there to be greater genetic variation even among those regions of those important genes that control body plan. So you get very different, and in fact, scientists think that the Hox expression, right, shifting the expression, shifting how these Hox genes are expressed, they themselves may change slightly, but the idea is, even though they're conserved, how we express them and where and when we express them can change the entire plan of the body, the structure of the body. And even though all these have the same structure, they all have vertebra, they can look very different. And they think that these Hox expressions are differing Hox expressions are what allow vertebrates to develop into such a large variation of animals, from cows to chickens to ducks to mice to rats to humans to dogs to fish. From fish on up, these vertebrates, we have many, many different forms or structures. And in part, they think it's this ability to have redundancy, have various extra copies of the genes that control these, when specific structures develop, how they develop, how long they develop, how many develop, how many legs do they develop into antennae, do they develop into pincers. These having that redundancy, having that modularity, having it separated into sections like head, thorax, and abdomen, have allowed vertebrates to evolve a large variety of organisms, of structures and body plans based on the same basic concept, which is there's a backbone, there's a brain, there's a backbone, And among land animals, and among land animals, four, right, tetrapods. We call them tetrapods. Land animals to birds all have these four, tetra meaning four appendages. You have 2 legs and 2 arms equals 4, 2 wings and 2 legs equals 4, 4 legs equals 4. So these tetrapods and vertebrates all have basically the same body plan in that, most general way. This body plan is the same among all vertebrates, among all tetrapods, but how we express them, how many of these Hox genes we have, when we express them, how we express them, can change all kinds of things. There's so many that we see the variety of animals that we see in the world today.